Regenerative ocean farming is the process of growing seafood and ocean products using the entire three-dimensional space of coastal waters, using no additional fresh water, fertilizers, or feed. In British Columbia, Indigenous peoples have been farming renewable ocean crops like shellfish and kelp for thousands of years. Foods like sugar kelp, abalone, oysters, mussels, and scallops require no additional feed in the nutrient-rich coastal waters of the Pacific Northwest. And when farmed in protected coastal areas, they even create additional habitat space for important fishery species like sea cucumbers, rockfish, and juvenile salmon. In this week's episode on regenerative ocean farming, we speak with local oyster hatchery and farm, Nova Harvest, to learn about the incredible food they're growing right here in Bamfield and how they're at the forefront of ocean farming innovation to automate and improve their farming practices for sustainable seafood production. Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 13 of the BMSC Climate Action Series, our very last webinar of this series. It's been such a wonderful journey so far, learning with you over the past 8 months about some of the interconnected social and ecological facets of the climate crisis that stem from our oceans. In today's episode, we'll get an inside look into how a small ocean farming business is growing one of the world's most sustainable protein sources from right here in Bamfield, and how a kelp farmer is working to rebuild important kelp coastal habitat. And although we can't answer your questions live today, we still encourage you to send them in by the Zoom Q&A function so we can pass them on to today's guests and maybe try and answer them through social media after the webinar. So to kick off today's episode, we'll chat with President and co-founder of Nova Harvest, JP Hasey, and General Manager Angela Fortune on the company's origins, their mission to make oysters one of the most accessible and sustainable protein sources, and how they get it all done in a remote coastal community.
Okay. My name is JP Hasey. I'm co-founder of Nova Harvest. We started the company about 12 years ago. I started that with my business partners are Joel and Julian German out of Nova Scotia. So met Julian at school when I was at university, and we've just stayed in touch. And about 12 years ago, they were out visiting, seeing what I was working on at University of British Columbia, and that was at the time was geoduck seed production. And so they were really excited about the opportunity, and we formed Nova Harvest and got our start at the Bamfield Marine Science Centre. And so that's a really incredible opportunity for us because they've got a high quality water source. And there was some infrastructure there that was underutilized at the time. So we were able to establish the company and kind of get our start in shellfish aquaculture production. Yeah, it was, so getting into this, I was like, knew just enough to be dangerous. And it has been a slog throughout that, but it's like I look at it as like an education, and I had to learn. You got to pay to learn, and so we had to. We've gone through a lot of iterations of what we are as a company, what the opportunity is in shellfish aquaculture. So originally starting out in geoduck seed production, we did that for a number of years, and then kind of stumbled into the opportunity of oyster, and that's a really incredible opportunity where we can grow the seed, the product, and then also sell that through right to the end consumer. So we're That's what we've been working on the last couple of years, and in doing that, we've had to kind of shift our business model significantly, and also there's just a lot more to learn for us there. But in getting into oyster production, we just kind of recognize opportunities for improvement in how some of the farming is done, and that's something we're working a lot on right now. So we've got great people at the hatchery. We also produce a huge volume of seed for the local BC industry, and the farming is kind of the new part of the business that we're working on and developing.
My name's Angela Fortune. I am the general manager of Nova Harvest. I've been here for just over 5 years. So Nova Harvest, the core business is the shellfish hatchery, which you've been seeing all day. Majority of what we produce is oyster seed for the BC oyster industry. So we do majority of the BC oyster seed at this point, which is very exciting. We also do some manila clams and not so much gooey duck anymore. We kind of had to pivot a bit in that direction. We now also have grown into a fully vertically integrated company. So we have ocean nurseries, a farm, and a processing plant. With that, we have 3 ocean tenures, and have recently just started a joint venture partnership with the investment arm of the Huu-ay-aht First Nations, so the Huu-ay-aht group of businesses. Really fascinating thing that the same batch of oysters will go to all these different farms, mostly all over Vancouver Island in different areas, and then seeing how different they are in the end, because it really depends on your farming method and the waters that they're grown, so it'll totally change what they look like, what they taste like. Much like grapes at a winery or something, it's all about the environment that they're grown in.
So if a terroir is for grapes, what would be the name for oysters?
Merroir.
Merroir.
Yeah.
An oyster merroir. Do you have a palate where you can tell where an oyster has been grown?
I don't know if I'm quite up to some people's palates, but definitely, I mean, I can tell anyways, the East Coast of Canada, West Coast of Canada, or that kind of taste, or they're if they're grown in Florida mud flats versus BC waters, there's a distinct difference.
Interesting.
Yeah, some aquaculture farms, and realized you can grow the most sustainable protein on the planet, which is oysters and clams, without using land or fresh water or fertilizer, and they actually have a net positive impact on the surrounding environment. And so since then I've been kind of obsessed. It's actually amazing, the increased production and biodiversity of an area surrounding a shellfish farm is incredible. All the different animals around it that like to settle in and grow, or the filtering of water that helps other species get light, or just increased water quality, and general just like surface area for all kinds of creatures to grow helps motivate me, I guess. And on top of that, we're constantly looking for ways to improve our energy use or footprint. So we recently were able to install some equipment using like heat pump technology and to recapture our hot water. And we were able to reduce our propane use by 90%. Things like changing out to LED lights for grow lights and things like that. We're kind of constantly looking for ways to do things more efficient and just like further increasing already the most sustainable protein ever that tastes delicious. I think one thing with regenerative ocean farming or general like strategy solutions for a better future is that people really push for sustainability without actually fully realizing the definition of sustainability, and that there are 3 ways in which something needs to be sustainable for it to actually be a legitimate solution that will like last. And so it needs to be environmentally sustainable, which probably gets the most amount of attention, socially sustainable, and then economically sustainable. And I think that is actually often the reason why really great ideas do not happen. Someone has a great idea of something that is environmentally sustainable. Hope if it is, and they do it right, it can be socially sustainable. There's other really good examples of people who have a great idea that's good for the environment and do not execute it, getting social license in that way. But having something to the point where it is then economically sustainable is what kind of makes or breaks a good environmentally sound idea, especially for industry. And I think that's something that we spent a lot of time working on, is trying to make this oyster farming model, it is environmentally sustainable, and we want to keep it that way. It is socially sustainable in that you have then providing good jobs to a remote community, working with the First Nations on it, and making sure that you're not impacting in a negative way your surrounding environment. And then, but the final one that is what I think has limited so many great ideas for regenerative farming in general is the economic sustainability of it. And so having things focused on that, whether it's encouraging innovation or helping startups get access to capital. There have been some really great opportunities for people like to get grants to help in that way. But more of that in a way that encourages entrepreneurs to find ways to make these really great green ideas a reality that will last.
Nova Harvest has a strong vision of regenerative ocean agriculture. But wow, producing the oyster seed for all of BC's oyster farmers? That's no small task. Let's go down to the hatchery to take a look at how these oysters are grown and how they keep these oyster babies happy, or what we call oyster larvae.
It is a spawning oysters day here at the hatchery. So we have this tank we made with channels. We made it black so that you can more easily see the egg or sperm in it. And here in this channel, here, we have oysters that are starting to broadcast spawn. So they put it into the water column. And what I'm doing is just flushing it out with water of the right temperature, and then collecting the eggs through a screen into a bucket where we'll kind of clean them up, and then make sure the eggs are fertilized and put them into, take the fertilized eggs and put them into tanks that are about just over 4,000 liters. They'll be there for about 24 hours. At that point, they go through a fertilized egg, veliger, swimming veliger, and then what we call a D larvae. So at that point they have a shell. They kind of look like a taco or a little Pac-Man swimming around. But yeah, after about 24, 48 hours, they're actively swimming around larvae with a shell and eating microalgae. The larger ones, what we're looking for is how ripe it is. So you can see these basically kind of veins here that are full of egg or sperm.
So can you tell right now, just by looking at it, if that's egg or sperm?
I would be not 100%, but think it's egg, based on just like how it shimmers.
Environment right for these oysters?
So it's really all about temperature and amount of food that they get. So back in there behind, so we keep the oysters for really a couple months, and gradually warming the water so they think it's spring. And then we hold them at about 22 degrees. Which is a lot warmer than the ocean temperature currently is in February. And then, yeah, just getting them the right amount of food. So a lot of microalgae every day. And then At that point, once they are nice and ripe, then we put them in to these spawning tables, and then we temperature shock them, cold water and hot water and cold water with a lot of food. Usually we'll open up, which is why I shuck this one open, to find a male, to sprinkle in a little bit of sperm that will help initiate so that the rest of them know it's time to start broadcast spawning.
Besides just getting the oysters to spawn successfully indoors over the winter, this team is thinking of everything. They're even collaborating with Vancouver Island University to crossbreed oysters that are more disease resistant and have a better chance of survival once out at the farm.
So these are our BFTs. And so these are the tanks that we put our newly fertilized eggs into. So we just went through a spawn. And so what we did was we let all the oysters spawn. Eggs meet sperm, get fertilized. We then rinse those eggs. So we're getting rid of all the dirt and the algae cells, but also really importantly, getting rid of all those sperm. So all we're left with is fertilized eggs. And they go into these tanks, which are 42,000 liters. Nope, that's not true. 4,200 liters, sorry.
Pretty big.
Yeah, and what's cool about these tanks is, or what's different about these tanks is it's stagnant water. So for the first 24 hours of their life cycle, like during that fertilization and then into like a larval stage, they need still water. So there's no flow, there's very little, well, there's air, but it's not like blasting air. And it's dark, so we wrap them up. So that really helps the success rate of fertilization.
Oysters are there.
So we had a pretty good spawn today. So we stocked these ones today at about 200 million oysters in each of these tanks. We filled 2 today. So we have approximately 400 million baby oysters starting their lives just here today, yep. And they'll stay in these tanks for between 24 to 48 hours. Lately we've been trying to push those 24 hours. We seem to have better success, less dropout, if we do it a bit faster.
Is dropout just like the ones that don't make it?
Yeah, either they don't get fertilized and they just are dead and they drop out, or they get fertilized but don't have quite enough energy or whatever it is to make it past that next kind of bar. And then we just kind of see that as this like pink smudges at the bottom of the tank at the end of the next morning. And that's our dropout. They're actually at this stage, well, when they're eggs, they're just white and colorless and boring. But after about 24 hours after fertilization, they're this like beautiful like rose gold color. It's like my favorite stage.
And you can see that color, like you'll open the lid and you can see it.
Not so much in here, but when we take them, because it's so dilute.
Right.
Like that's 200 million oysters is a lot, but that's 4,000 liters of water. Yeah. So it's not like the dilution factor is real. But when we take them down from the bottom, we catch them on a screen, and that screen just gets this like beautiful paste of this like rose gold color. I just completed my master's in marine biology, looking at actually juvenile invertebrates, mortality in juvenile invertebrates. So pretty applicable. And my research was done here in Bamfield, which is kind of how I learned about this whole thing and fell in love with the place.
Full circle.
Yeah.
What excites you about working at Nova Harvest?
I love just like the hands-on aspect, like we're like creating these oysters, and like we're there like every step of the way, like pushing them through and finding better ways to do it. But also, I love like the aspect of just trying to create like a more responsible protein source, like really, and trying to make that more accessible. Like we push out so many oysters, and with the farm going up, it's the way we want it to. Like we're trying to get oysters to be like one of your main kind of like grocery store proteins, and that's like really exciting because it's a super sustainable and like responsible protein.
For those of you second guessing yourselves, you heard that right. The tanks behind Shannon have 200 million teeny tiny oyster babies in them. But this is only the start of these oysters' lives. They still need a lot of love and care to keep growing into healthy adult oysters. Hatchery technician Olivia Walker takes us through some of the daily maintenance it takes just to keep these babies happy and growing.
We are taking a tank down, or cone tank down, and so this is where the oysters live for most of their lives in the hatchery, or not actually the first little bit of their lives in the hatchery, about 3 weeks. And so we have 2 screens set up down here, and we just drain the water out, and then the oysters will catch themselves on the screens. And so we use a screen that's going to catch all of the oysters, and then I will grade them on a bigger screen later, but we want to make sure that we're catching everything in like a controlled manner. Now I'm going to transfer carefully the larvae into my bucket. Bucket of larvae. I just saw what they were doing down here even 4 years ago, and I thought, that's cool, I want to work there one day. And so just how things work out and, you know, job availability and whatnot, I didn't get on with them until last year. But yeah, I've wanted to be here for a long time, and I'm happy that I'm finally here. Like, I can come into the hatchery with like a plan for my day, and then that can just be totally like thrown to the wind based on what's going on. And it's not necessarily like things are going wrong and things aren't going well. It's like I'm always listening to the animals and like what they're telling me. And so I say, like, we take them down every 2 days and grade them, but really it's up to them. It's like what they're looking like. And so that's kind of what's cool about it, is I'm like listening to these millions of babies who are telling me what they need, which is kind of cool. So it's kind of always changing, and there's lots of like problem solving and like puzzles you have to fix and stuff like that, which is cool and exciting. So we have, it looks like 148 mils to me, something like that. This is the 150 mark here, and we're just below that. And so now I'm gonna go put these in their tank. And like I said before, 2 days ago I put 90 mils in here, and now we're at 140 mils. So I've had 50 mils of growth, which I like. That's good.
Happy babies.
Happy babies.
So the plus should be the nice, healthy ones?
Exactly, yeah, it should be the nice ones. And so I'd just like to scan over the whole slide as much as I can to see if I see any individuals that don't look good. But these guys look really great to me. They've got nice dark guts. They're swimming well. Their vellums look good. So now I am putting the oysters back in their tank. And so the tank is clean. They've been given new water. And I'm just taking them out of their volumetric cone here and putting them in their tank.
As Olivia mentioned, besides the constant tank cleaning, all those millions of oyster babies need a lot of food. But being the innovators they are, they've thought this through at Nova Harvest and have a whole operation just to make enough algae to feed the oyster larvae. To show us some of the work involved in feeding them, we chatted with algae technician Julia Themelis on how they grow enough food to keep these oysters fed.
So my main role is to culture the algae here and keep it clean so that I can then feed it to the oysters and then they can grow. So that's like the gist of my role. And the key part is keeping it really, really clean because we don't want to be feeding our oysters bacteria-filled algae. So that's kind of what this room is for. It's separate from the hatchery, and that's to make sure that everything stays sterile. That's what we use the UV hood for. And yeah, that's the main role.
Right.
Yeah. So right now what I'll be doing is transfers. So that happens, the small flasks you transfer monthly. And the idea is that they're barely touched, which means they would have the least bacteria in them as possible. And then these larger flasks are weekly flasks, and that's what I'll be doing right now. I'll be transferring the algae from flask to flask and also flask to jug. And the main idea is that you're scaling up in volume. So from the flask, I'll inoculate a jug. From the jug, I'll inoculate a carboy. And then carboys can either be fed directly to the larvae, or the jugs can go inoculate the bioreactors. So that's the process. Yeah.
So this is the Algae Library.
This is the Algae Library. That's what we call this top shelf here, that because it's the samples we'll pull from to like keep all the stocks fresh. So yeah, this is the Algae Library.
Can you tell us a bit about why they're all different colors?
Basically, every color is a different species. So we have diatoms and flagellates, both key to oyster growth. Any possible bacteria present, and then pouring it off.
Transferring and keeping algae alive is no small task. Julia makes it sound easy, but maintaining an entire algae library on top of scaling up production means being extremely meticulous on planning and keeping things super clean during lab work.
From flask to jug, this is a jug that is 1 week old. And this is what we use to inoculate the reactors. So to feed all the oysters we have, we need a lot of algae, and the volume comes from these reactors. So you inoculate a reactor at a low volume of water, and then you slowly scale it up over time. because if this reactor was full of water and I put this one jug in there, it would probably just dilute itself and crash. So the idea is that you start with a low volume, the amount of nutrients that you need for that volume, a low level of light, and you're inputting your CO2. And then as that gets more dense, you can then start to scale up the volume. So after inoculation, the next day I'll count the reactor, see what the density is. If it's grown since I've last inoculated it, we can start scaling it up. And then 7 days after inoculation of a reactor, it'll be full, and that's when it can start feeding out. So this reactor is actually not quite full yet. It has about 100 liters to go. So this was inoculated last Tuesday, and it should be ready to harvest overnight tonight. Okay, so we can see the graph over 2 weeks. This is a lot of it being turned on and off. But if we go for 1 week, you can see when I started to inoculate the reactor. So that blue line is the volume increasing over time. And then the pink line is the nutrient addition. So as it started to grow, it needed more nutrients. Yellow for light, as it started to grow, needs more light. And then this green line is a really nice growth curve, which is kind of a direct result of the increase in nutrients and the increase in light. And then that's the algae increasing.
To track how the oysters are growing with a constant supply of algae, Nova Harvest has figured out a nifty little way to keep track of larval growth and what it means for their hatchery production.
So this is our way that we track growth daily. And so it gives us kind of immediate response on how we're doing and how our feeding is going. And also tells me if the larvae have grown every single day. And so the main thing that I'm looking at daily is the shell length. And so even on days when I don't take the larvae down, I'll take a sample from their tank and I'll look at them under the microscope and measure them. And so we can see here the 3 different batches that we've already had this season. And so if we go to today, which is day 13, and we're O3, so oyster 3, and our shell length today is 233. That's our average shell length, so average amongst all 4 tanks that we have. And we can see that we're actually bigger than our last 2 batches and bigger than our goal. And the goal is something that I came up with based on our best batch of last year. And as you can see, overall, we've been beating that goal so far, which is pretty exciting. And the big thing that we wanted to focus on this year was consistency. And you can see that we've been pretty consistent so far with our batches. So that's just kind of what we want to keep doing, is keep hitting that so that we can tell customers, yes, we can have larvae ready by this date. And so the more consistent we can get, the better. And so that's the main graph that I'm looking at daily. And that also gives us information about feeding too.
And as these larvae keep growing, they're transferred from tank to tank until they reach the size of some bubbling quinoa at 4 millimeters wide. These little oysters have come a long way, but there's still one more stop to make before they can go out to the farm.
Yeah, what we're standing on right now is the first ocean nursery that we built. And so oysters, once they're large enough, they leave the hatchery, the main hatchery building. They'll move into our greenhouse nurseries for a while, and then they'll either be sold to customers, or if they're staying locally to the West Coast, we'll put them into our floating upwelling system here. Not currently running, which is why it's nice and quiet.
This ocean nursery is called a floating upwelling system, or FLUPSY for short. Basically, this massive structure floats at the surface of the water and acts as a nursery for the growing oysters. Held in tanks off each of the offshoot arms, oyster larvae are constantly feeding on the naturally occurring algae in the water. And just like the tanks in the hatchery, these larvae are continuously in suspension, as a solar-powered water wheel pulls water through a central channel and creates a pull-through of water in each mesh-bottomed tank.
Once the oysters are about a 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch in size, then they move out of the ocean nursery into the actual farm gear.
All these moving parts may look pretty straightforward on camera, but there's a ton of work going on behind the scenes to keep things running smoothly. We chatted with Administrator Marielle and engineering interns Ali and Katie on how they help support the innovation and expansion going on at Nova Harvest.
The most exciting work is kind of watching how everything changes and how quickly we seem to be progressing. There's a lot of good idea people in there, and they're just constantly building new things, innovating new technology, basically, and seeing the changes, because they'll build a system and then they'll say, we want to make this better, we want to make it fit in a smaller space and do more. And then they just figure it out and they do it. And then I get to be part of that support staff. Every once in a while I get to jump in and help out hands-on, but mostly kind of behind the scenes and the support role. It was never really part of the plan. I didn't even think that this kind of job existed. I guess I knew that, I went to a restaurant and ate oysters, but I didn't really think of where it came from and all the people that worked to get that together.
Since for 5 months now.
So what brought you out here? How did you find out about Nova?
So I actually found it on my school's internship board, and it just caught my eye. I was having trouble finding jobs that I thought I'd be interested in, and I saw this one and I got so excited because I've always had a passion for the ocean and the outdoors. My sister's in marine biology, so I've kind of had that aspect of it in my life. And I just got so excited. I knew what Bamfield was. I'd never been. And I've always been interested in kind of the marine mechanical, so more boat mechanics and everything like that. So it kind of seemed like a perfect mix. And yeah, that was basically what got me interested in. I applied and then here I am.
That's amazing.
Is optimizing the whole farming system, just making sure that we can make it more automated and more efficient. So essentially we use a lot of CAD software to redesign things, a lot of communication with stakeholders, different equipment, different people who, different engineers who create our machinery and everything like that, just because, again, we want to make it more automated. So communication with them and a lot of design, research and development. Yeah, that's basically what we do on our day-to-day. Mostly computer work, but it is nice to get that experience, that hands-on experience, building something, helping out, building a shed, figuring out solar panels and everything like that. So we do get a lot of hands-on experience as well, which is nice to step away from the computer sometimes. It's funny, I always thought that I wanted to do that, but I never realized this was an option. I always said, like I said, marine mechanical with boat mechanics, but now that I've seen this, I think it's an industry that has so much room to grow, especially in the engineering field of it. So I definitely see myself coming back into this field and continuing to evolve it, because there's so much room for that. So we'll see what happens, but I think that would definitely be an awesome path to go down.
The main thing that I was drawn to was the full project aspect, getting to do the design work, then parts of the manufacturing, ordering all the materials, and just getting all of that full circle experience, so to speak. That was what really drew me to it. The only engineers in this company, and we're not even full engineers, and we actually get this much responsibility, this much ability to make decisions for the project, which is super cool, but also a lot of responsibility. So yeah.
It's clear that a lot of work goes into producing the oyster seed. And now that we've seen how the oysters are grown from egg to larva to teenage oysters in the nursery, let's take a look at how these are farmed in the wild and check out some of the regenerative ocean farming practices at Nova's farm that makes oysters a net positive seafood product. Our first stop is the flip farm, a method of growing oysters in bins at the surface of the water along long lines of rope. This New Zealand-based farming system helps keep water flowing through the bins to keep those oysters well fed.
Yeah, so we're just having a look inside here to see what we've got. Something you can see here is just all of these organisms that are also living on this system. That what's really cool, in a marine environment, anywhere you put a hard substrate, life finds it and it starts growing a system around it. And that's what is oysters are ultimately just massive amounts of surface area. So they're removing nutrients from the environment. They also are supplying habitat or substrate for other things to live on, in and around. And that's kind of the ecosystem that gets created by these farms to provide that net benefit to the system.
So underneath here where all those empty shells are you sort of expecting it to be attracting other organisms and other oysters settling?
That's right. You see, like as you're working the gear, either pulling deep water stacks up or the surface gear, you can just see the just all the other life and diversity that is in and around this system, and it's and that's just something that it's not something we've kind of quantified, but I think it'd be really interesting for people to like seriously look at, and I'm sure it has been done to some capacity. But just that habitat that is added or into the system or that it creates for other organisms is like incredibly substantial. Like you can see the long lines we have here, like that. Otherwise, this would just be open water. There wouldn't be other things here. And so as we add this substrate to this surface area, you get that whole system going around it. I really enjoy them cooked. I think it's an incredible product. That's something we are really keen on doing, is like trying to get more cooked products available for people, because I think it's something that a raw oyster is understandably a bit of an acquired way to consume them. And so I think there's a lot of people that don't maybe appreciate the raw oyster, but would really appreciate a cooked product. So that's something we're really keen to try and develop more of, and have more opportunities for people to consume this protein.
While the flip farms are a neat method of growing oysters, they don't take advantage of the space in the entire water column. That's where the vertical stack farms come into play. And although we couldn't take you under the Nova Harvest farm, JP brought up a stack to show us just how well these vertical stacks use the space in the water column and play an important role in the surrounding ecosystem.
So this is a product that we've bagged up and is just waiting to go to market. But it's also just an example of how we would grow oysters in deep water. So this is called a stack, and it consists of trays. Each tray is an independent unit. So when you bring the product up, you undo the ropes, you take the stack apart, dump the product out. So currently something we're working on with a project we have with our farming partners, the Hoyt group of business, is a new technology where we can actually automate this component of farming to allow just more the labor to become more where you're an operator, not kind of just a general laborer. And that's something we think is really important for developing the industry and growing more product. Yeah, it's a lot more efficient use of the water column, and so in a specific area you can get a lot more production out of your farm, being able to farm beyond just the surface area, that whole deep water column where you've got access to a lot more water, a lot more flow, and also then allows you where you can you're not high density, but it is just a more efficient use of your gear as well on the surface, as when you are pulling up to work the gear, you've got more product coming to the surface for you to grade, manage, or farm essentially.
And do you find that there is an effect, or do you have any concerns when it comes to climate change, changing environmental conditions for oyster farming?
That's definitely something we think about, but it's not. We're also kind of the mind where we can. There's a lot we can do to kind of shift our practices and behaviors to kind of buffer some of those impacts. So we do see the ocean kind of changing just in the short period of time we've been operating. But it's something that I'm really optimistic that we'll be able to solve a lot of those challenges through just breeding and genetic things. So, which is we're fortunate to be able to do that for the species we operate with. But there are other species in the environment that are going to feel impact, and that's something we definitely need to be aware of. But in terms of the actual farming and being able to farm, I'm quite optimistic that we'll be able to solve a lot of those challenges at the pace that they come.
I suppose with the stack farming, if the water's a bit cooler at depth, could you adjust sort of the depth during like summer heat waves, for example?
That's right. So being able to use that deep water, you can bring them up into shallower water where you can increase productivity in warmer conditions, or higher when there can be higher food availability in that. But if there is also a problem, you have that ability to sink down to deeper water, and it's almost like you're using a different ocean per se.
They even hired me on to lower the stack back into the water and let those oysters keep growing. But once they're grown, we wanted to know the final steps at the farm to get them ready to ship out. We found farm manager Yota Kano to learn more about these final steps to prepare the oysters and got the lowdown from JP on where these oysters are heading out after these last stages.
We are grading oysters. Kind of we grade through the 1.5-inch mesh screen.
That's what this
here.
cylinder is, hey?
Yeah, and so we are kind of smaller one goes through the mesh screen and the bigger one goes through.
So you're trying to
Screen.
keep the bigger one.
Yeah, so we have to keep the kind of a size uniform for the customers. Some customer likes really big ones.
Yeah.
Some really like small ones like wrapping. So, yep.
And so you're trying to sort through right now and
Yeah, taking out some kind of muscles on it. So the muscle set is kind of a big problem
Okay.
during the springtime.
Oh.
It kind of connect together and doesn't tumble well in the water. Yeah.
So you're constantly having to take those off?
Yeah.
Gotcha. So can you tell just by looking at the oyster which one's a good one for the customer?
Like these ones, like a nice deep cup and a lot of space, yeah. And the size kind of a handful size, yeah.
That's a good
So-
looking oyster.
I eat in raw and sometimes kind of deep fry it, yeah. So,
So how often do you have to do this?
so we have 12 lines out there.
Yeah.
So we have to do pretty much every day as a grading through. Sometimes kind of like harvesting oyster from the line all day,
Oh.
and then grading through the grading for a whole day, like
Wow.
kind of depending on weather.
Right.
Yeah.
So rain or shine, you're out here grading oysters?
Yeah, I prefer kind of a cloudy weather
Yeah.
because when it's sunny it gets hot. It's not good for the oysters. So I didn't want to kind of a cool environment. So like I like this kind of a little bit raining and cool weather. Yeah.
So these oysters would have been seed about 16 months ago, and they came out to the farm when they were about a 1 inch in shell length, and you can actually see the difference on the shell. So there's a little bit of a change in how they grow when they come out to the farm. So these are about 16 months old and now ready to go to market. Yeah, that's how it's happening now. I mean, ultimately what we're moving towards is automation of all of these steps that you've seen, because it's something where like our goal or vision is to have like scalable farming model so that we can grow like really meaningful supplies of shellfish. So that means it's like limiting handling at every single step where we can, so that you can have your workers aren't doing kind of jobs that like machines should be doing, that they're focusing on in more operator type positions of the machines, and that way we can handle more product and push more through to the consumer. The oysters themselves and the culture gear they're growing in create a habitat that wouldn't be here otherwise, and so it's actually a net benefit to the system having this production here. So it's like regenerative farming is kind of a new term that you're hearing to kind of describe this, but it's been going on since the beginning of shellfish farming, which is something like the First Nations did thousands of years ago. And it's one of few things you can grow and just have a net benefit on the system that you're culturing it in. And that's what's really amazing about it, is the opportunity it provides, where it's literally the more of it we do, the better the system is around it. And I'm not aware of another example of that for protein production. And that's something that is, that's what our vision is, to be doing more of this farming, and to figure out scalable technology so that we can be providing, this high quality shellfish protein to the consumer, so they can be making a better choice about the protein they choose to eat.
Yeah, absolutely. Seems like a really natural fit into kind of the climate solutions movement and sustainable aquaculture.
Yeah, that's right. And it's something that is, just the carbon footprint of shellfish production is just so incredibly low. And it's something that, as we develop this technology for more efficient automation, we're adopting like solar technology to remove we'll be able to totally remove carbon source from shellfish production here within the next couple of years. And so it's something that it's just a phenomenal opportunity to give a really high quality protein to people that, and then if it's displacing some of the other terrestrial proteins that can be significantly more damaging to a system or a higher carbon footprint, it just gives a consumer that option to be making like a really good choice and still eating a high quality food.
Good
So let's
for
look
people
at,
and good for the planet.
that's right, and the more we do, the better everything gets. So it's just like
Yeah.
such an incredible opportunity.
That's awesome. Our next guest today is Leanne Ennis, who lives in Wookwe, Half Moon Bay, Sunshine Coast, on the unceded Sechelt Nation territory. Leanne was born in Labrador and is learning about her Inuit and Mi'kmaq ancestry on her mother's side. She was raised on BC's north coast in an adventurous fishing family, a heritage she holds dear. Leanne has always been involved in the delivery of aquatic STEM science programming for youth. As a UVic and BMSC alumni, she gained formative experiences in the wet lab and aquavan at the Vancouver Aquarium. With BC Parks as parks naturalist and as host and program director of the Loon Foundation's Iris Griffith Nature School. Observing a need for kelp restoration on the south coast, Leanne has taken up the restorative practice of kelp cultivation for a permitted aquaculture lease on the Sunshine Coast. She has been trialing various methods of kelp seeding and outplanting for 4 years. Leanne is optimistic about the potential of regenerative kelp farming and various new restoration techniques. So we're so glad that she could join us today to tell us a little bit about how she got into this world and what even is kelp regenerative farming. Thanks for joining us, Leanne. Please go ahead.
Hi, Neri. Thank you for inviting me. It's my pleasure to join you here from Wookwe, Sechelt territory. And I'm honored to live, work, and play here in the Sechelt territory, and also honored to practice regenerative kelp farming. It was a few years ago I took an reinterest in kelp farming when there were some really significant heat waves, marine heat waves passed through here in 2014, 2015. And over the last 10, 20 years, I've seen a major reduction in bull kelp in the central Georgia Strait or Salish Sea. So following the marine heat waves and the loss of our top predator, the sunflower star, and sea star wasting disease, I knew that it was important to look into kelp cultivation and revisit my roots in and interest in seaweeds in general that came to me when I was at Bamfield Marine Station as a student. So the time came when COVID arrived, and I had been dabbling in kelp cultivation for a couple years on a permitted lease here on the Sunshine Coast. And when COVID arrived, I decided just to throw myself right into it and have been since practicing regenerative kelp farming for habitat and all the natural benefits that come to cultivating seaweed.
That's really such a cool story. So place-based, and it's really neat that you've drawn on your history and your previous experiences. I'm wondering if you could describe a little bit to us what kelp farming actually looks like. Also, if you could expand, you mentioned that there's benefits for the ecosystem. So what are some of those benefits then?
Absolutely. So to farm kelp, you have to understand the cryptic nature of the life cycle that in the laminarian kelps, brown kelps that I cultivate, the bull kelp, sugar kelp, alaria, they have microscopic life stages. So understanding that is key to cultivating kelp. And I love microscopes, and I have a couple microscopes here at home. And in the right season, in the summer and fall, I go and collect reproductive tissues and do a series of steps to have them release their spores. And then I use the microscopes to have a good look at them, and then we inoculate onto tubes of twine that look like this. This is your standard tube of twine.
Very cool.
And the idea is to get the spores onto the twine. Once you have that happen, you incubate your seeded spools for 3, 4, 5, 6 weeks in a controlled environment in your aquariums. That's key to the whole process. You have to have clean, cold, filtered water. You have to understand the nutrients that are needed, necessary for the little gametophytes to grow. Then the gametophytes, male and female, find each other, they have sex, and a zygote develops. And from that zygote is a sporophyte. So the great thing about these seeded spools is there's a little piece of string right there that I can snip off and check on the health and the stage, life stage of the gametophytes. And when the sporophytes finally show up, it's a day for celebration, as you've gone on to the next stage of development. The sporophyte will grow into the large macrophytes, the characteristic macrophytes that we all know as bull kelp. So you did an excellent segment previously on bull kelp out at Bamfield. I watched, that was wonderful. So some of those beautiful macrocystis kelps out there on the West Coast, we don't have on the inside of Vancouver Island. And really, we're really lacking, and sorry to say that a lot of our bull kelp, Nereocystis luteciana, has disappeared on the inside waters due to warming temperatures, predation by urchins. There's urchin barrens in this area. We're severely affected by urchin barrens. So with the loss of this kelp, we've lost major fish habitat. So, you know, juvenile salmonids, when they leave the river systems up the inlets as little tiny salmon, they are in need of habitat. Near shore habitat is so important. So they're traveling out of the river systems, out of the estuaries, and they're acclimating to saltwater, and they're headed out to sea. If those little fish don't find suitable habitat to hide in, some nice bull kelp, they will get predated upon. And this is what's happening on the inside of the strait. So I felt a desperate need to become involved in kelp cultivation for habitat provisioning for fish. And I reached out to a local aquaculture leaseholder who had been previously growing oysters. And he was open to cultivating kelp with me, And so we partnered, and 4 years ago, we started seeding lines and laying lines at his lease. And with great success, we were pleased to say that we grew upwards to 3,000 meters of kelp the very first year. The benefits also include, so habitat, I'd say, is key. Carbon sequestration, of course. Kelp will incorporate that carbon and draw down carbon. It also cleans the water of, if there's excess nutrients in the water. Nitrogen is important. It uptakes nitrogen, of course. So bioremediation is a major function of kelp. So it's got regenerative benefits, mitigation, and nutrition. Of course, there's a place in our regenerative kelp farm allotted to producing food product. And we have since taken on a third partner who is interested in developing a product to go to Vancouver, developing a fresh kelp product for restaurants.
Seems like there's a lot of moving pieces and a lot of innovation in different realms. And I'm glad you touched on some of the different uses for kelp to ecosystems and animals, but also to humans. Yes. I'm curious, what are some of the challenges to your work and what could sort of help overcome them, or to kelp farming in general?
Well, it's important to have an existing aquaculture lease. if you were to start from scratch with a green lease, the amount of permitting involved is a little bit overwhelming. So I really think partnering or pairing with someone who already has a lease and then applying for aquatic plant culture license onto that existing lease would be less of a barrier to getting into kelp farming or seaweed farming. So we need research and academic to co-create this seaweed industry with people who have, traditional skills like aquaculture industry. We need these two groups to work together to get more farms in the water, more.
So I'm curious, in your eyes then, where is the future of regenerative kelp farming going? Where do you see that?
I've thought about this. Well, I'm currently reading a paper by Karen Philby Dexter, and it's called Leveraging the Blue Economy to Transform Marine Forest Restoration. And in this paper, Karen describes that marriage of seaweed cultivation and restoration practice. And I really believe that that's where it needs to go in this decade, UN decade of ocean restoration. We need all hands on deck, everyone cooperating in order to expand this industry and leverage our skills in both academia and in industry. So I see this as the most important thing, cooperating, incorporating Indigenous knowledge, creating a community of practitioners, restoration practitioners, in order to scale up these activities of kelp restoration or kelp cultivation, regenerative ocean farming. Also, another fellow back east, I just want to mention Dr. Terry Chopin out of University of New Brunswick, who has always advocated for integrated multi-trophic aquaculture. So that's putting the oysters and bivalves together with the kelp. Those two go really well together. There's another fellow named Bren Smith out of Green Wave. He's created a whole movement on the East Coast. He's a Newfoundlander and he's working down in Connecticut, trying to train as many kelp farmers as possible to scale up this industry.
So Leanne, you've mentioned so many great organizations and folks out here working on kelp. So who should we be keeping our eyes on in the future, in addition to you and the work you're doing around kelp?
Well, that's a great question. Thank you, Ineri. I know in your own home turf here, you have an excellent program has been begun out of Bamfield Marine Station with Dr. Chris Neufeld's Kelp Rescue Program. And I understand there'll be a great effort scaling up soon, seeding green gravel. And that is an interesting technique where the kelp spores are settled onto gravel and then seeded out by the thousands. And I look forward to the work of the Kelp Rescue team, and I will definitely keep an eye on that. I think that there's a great need for kelp rescue here and there. Another one is Ocean Wise out of Vancouver. Ocean Wise has a seaforestation program where they're going to be scaling up as well, using green gravel and other techniques in and around Vancouver, working with the Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh First Nation, perhaps the city of Vancouver, and other universities to study kelp restoration as natural climate solution. So there's many players working on kelp. There's a Shriv, Cascadia seaweed has been studying the use of kelp cultivated lines by fish for fish habitat. And Dr. Colin Bates has some interesting work happening. I read in their Cascadia Seaweed newsletter last week. So yeah, the BC coast has got a lot of kelp initiatives going on to watch out for, and I look forward to seeing some good results soon.
Nova Harvest and Vital Kelp are just a couple examples of ocean farmers that are turning towards regenerative ocean farming techniques to grow affordable, high-quality ocean products with net positive impacts to the surrounding ecosystems. And one of the other techniques out there is called integrated multi-trophic farming, where farmers even grow shellfish, kelp, and sometimes fish together in a way that helps all of the organisms grow. So to end today, thank you again to all our guests in today's episode for sharing their great work with us. And as usual, we'll end today with our climate action recommendations. First up, whether it's eating oysters or kelp, food systems are a huge part of the climate solutions movement. And it's becoming increasingly apparent that the way we eat right now takes a lot of energy, especially industrially farmed protein. There is no one way to eat that will save the planet, but we can certainly start being curious about where our food comes from and support local farmers to make good quality food available for everyone. So we'll link to our favorite podcasts and articles on regenerative agriculture in the show notes. Second up, Natural Resources Canada has finally opened the public consultation period for a Just Transition Act. And lucky for us, 350 Canada has made the easiest one-click tool for folks to voice their priorities for a just transition that puts people and planet first, creates good green jobs, and aligns with the scale and urgency of climate science. So it's our job to hold government accountable to their promises, and now is the perfect opportunity to do so with this really easy one-click tool. So again, we'll link to that in our show notes. Finally, we've seen throughout this series how the ocean is directly impacted by climate change, but how it's also a huge part of the climate solutions movement, and everyday people are central to making that change happen. We are all connected to the ocean in some way, so engaging in action in your own community, individually, in your work or school, and especially through collective action, helps keep our planet and oceans healthy. And the great news is that there's no one way to engage in climate action. So each of us doing our part to educate each other and to make community along the way is part of this process. We know that the core of the climate crisis is driven by capitalism, colonialism, racism, and other ugly isms out there. So working towards social justice is also central to climate justice and sustainable climate action. So with that, we hope you stay hopeful, stay curious, and stay engaged in your own way as we all work together towards this greatest challenge of our generation. We want to say a huge thanks to all our guests in this series and to all our audience members who've joined us from all around the world these past 8 months. And just a reminder that all these episodes are freely available on the Bamfield Marine Sciences Center YouTube channel, so we'll link to that playlist in our show notes. Thank you for joining us today. It's been a pleasure learning with you.